Screams shattered the calm of Round Rock's suburbs. A woman's cry for help echoed down Maple Street as a black SUV sped away, its tinted windows reflecting the late evening sun. A stack of fake HOA violation slips scattered in the wind behind it, evidence of the shadowy hands that had dropped them in haste. Neighbors peeked through curtains but dared not step outside. Fear had already gripped the neighborhood, and that night the seeds of terror had been sown. For years, Round Rock had been the kind of place people dreamed of raising their families. Lawns were trimmed, mailboxes painted, and children pedaled bicycles freely on quiet streets. Among the many households was that of Jack Donnelly, a retired Navy SEAL, and his wife Hannah. After decades of service in dangerous corners of the world, Jack had finally found peace here. The Donnellys' modest home with its white fences symbolized everything they thought they'd earned: safety, stability, and normalcy. But behind that perfect suburban image, something sinister had begun to stir. It started small, a notice on a neighbor's door warning of a fine for an unapproved garden gnome. A threatening letter slipped under a family's doormat about a vehicle parked at the wrong angle. At first, people assumed it was their homeowners association tightening rules. But then came the late-night knocks, the men in cheap uniforms claiming to be security officers of the HOA, their tone too sharp, their eyes too cold. The leader of these men, Trevor Langley, was a name whispered with unease. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had tasted power and refused to let it go. To the residents, he was nothing more than a self-appointed enforcer, issuing commands no one dared challenge. Yet his control grew quickly, feeding on the silence of a community too afraid to resist. Hannah noticed the change before Jack did. She saw children vanish from playgrounds, neighbors cross the street rather than exchange greetings, and gatherings that once filled summer evenings now replaced by locked doors and drawn blinds. Fear had become the unspoken language of the neighborhood. Jack, though, felt it differently. His instincts, sharpened by years of military service, tingled every time he saw Trevor's men loitering by a corner, jotting down notes, or staring too long at his home. Unlike his neighbors, Jack had learned to read people, and what he read in those men was not regulation, but intimidation. Still, he stayed quiet at first. He watched. He observed. He collected details others overlooked: their mismatched badges, the absence of real identification, and the way they never addressed official HOA leaders. Slowly, Jack began keeping a notebook. What was happening in Round Rock was no accident. It was an organized effort. The Donnellys became targets sooner than expected. One evening, as Hannah returned from the grocery store, she found Trevor leaning against their front porch railing, a slip of paper in hand. His smirk was cold, his words sharper than the warm evening air. "Violation notice," he said, holding it out. "Your mailbox paint doesn't meet HOA standards. Fines due by the end of the week." Hannah frowned. Their mailbox was freshly painted white, exactly like every other house on the street. She tried to reason with him, but Trevor's gaze turned icy. "Don't test me, Mrs. Donnelly," he warned. "We're watching." That was the moment Jack stepped onto the porch. He didn't raise his voice or move quickly, but something in his steady stance and piercing stare made Trevor shift uncomfortably. For the first time, the enforcer seemed unsure of himself. He crumpled the notice, stuffed it into Hannah's hand, and walked away with a muttered threat. Jack knew then the peace of Round Rock was under siege, not from petty HOA disputes, but from a criminal scheme designed to exploit fear. And the Donnellys were now squarely in the crosshairs. That night, as the street lamps buzzed overhead and shadows danced across the lawns, Jack sat by the window, notebook in hand. His mind, trained to detect threats in faraway war zones, was now focused on the place he had chosen to call home. He could sense a storm coming, one that would test not only his resolve but the courage of the entire community. Round Rock had always been a quiet place. But quiet places, Jack knew, often made the loudest battlegrounds when evil decided to walk their streets. In the days following Trevor's confrontation on the Donnelly porch, the atmosphere in Round Rock grew heavier. It wasn't only the Donnellys who felt it. Every family on Maple Street sensed a shadow pressing in. Conversations that once drifted cheerfully across fences now dissolved into hurried whispers, and the once vibrant sense of community shrank into silence. Trevor's men had become a constant presence. They weren't police, nor were they officially sanctioned by the Homeowners Association, but they carried themselves with the authority of both. Their uniforms, hastily stitched and uneven, gave an illusion of legitimacy to outsiders. Yet to the residents, every crooked badge and mismatched insignia was a reminder of the farce. Still, few dared to challenge them. It began with citations, small, almost laughable at first. A fine for leaving a recycling bin visible on the curb, a warning about wind chimes being too loud, another for a garden hose left uncoiled. But it quickly escalated into threats. A family on Elm Street was told their fence would be condemned unless they paid a cash fee. Another neighbor discovered that the locks on his shed had been tampered with after refusing to hand over money. Fear spread faster than the truth, and with it, Trevor's grip tightened. Hannah watched these changes unfold with unease. She noticed her friend Melissa, who used to host weekend barbecues, had stopped coming outside altogether. Children no longer rode bikes past the cul-de-sac, and elderly couples who once strolled leisurely now kept their blinds drawn. The vibrancy of Round Rock seemed to dim each day, replaced with suspicion and isolation. Jack's perspective was different. His training had taught him to see patterns where others saw randomness. To him, Trevor's men weren't enforcing rules. They were executing a campaign. Their method was psychological warfare, something Jack had encountered before, though never in a suburban neighborhood. By keeping residents off balance, Trevor maintained control without ever needing outright violence, at least not yet. Still, Jack couldn't act recklessly. He knew that charging head-on into this threat without proof would risk alienating his neighbors. Instead, he began quietly documenting every encounter. He recorded the times Trevor's men appeared, the addresses they targeted, even the car models they drove. Each detail was written carefully into his notebook. Evidence for the day when silence could no longer protect them. One evening, Hannah confronted him at the kitchen table as he scribbled notes under the dim glow of a lamp. "Jack, this isn't just about us, is it?" she asked softly. He paused, then shook his head. "No, it's about the whole neighborhood. They're feeding on fear. The longer people stay quiet, the stronger they'll get." Her hand rested over his. "Then we can't stay quiet either." But speaking up was easier said than done. The following week, Trevor orchestrated a more public display of control. His men stood at the entrance of Maple Street, stopping cars and demanding proof of residency. Neighbors driving home were forced to show IDs, while visitors were turned away with threats of trespassing charges. It wasn't legal, but it was effective. Few were willing to challenge men who looked official enough to intimidate. The Donnellys watched from their front porch as this unfolded. Parents clutched children close, and even the bravest residents lowered their heads, hoping not to draw attention. For Jack, it was confirmation. Trevor's strategy wasn't about order. It was about dominance. Meanwhile, Trevor thrived on the fear he cultivated. His voice carried across the street as he lectured a neighbor about lawn maintenance, his men laughing in the background. It wasn't the fines or rules that mattered. It was the humiliation, the reminder that he held power and they did not. But not everyone was willing to remain silent. A young father named Daniel spoke out one afternoon when Trevor's men issued him a citation for unsafe play equipment in his backyard. "You're not the HOA," Daniel snapped, snatching the paper from their hands. His defiance was bold but short-lived. That night his car tires were slashed and graffiti was sprayed across his garage, "Obey or leave." The message was clear. Resistance would be punished. Hannah's fear grew, but so did her resolve. She found herself standing at the windows late at night, watching shadows move along the sidewalks. Jack, too, grew restless. The lines between his old world of missions and the quiet life he had sought blurred with every passing day. He had faced trained soldiers and ruthless enemies, but there was something uniquely unsettling about this enemy, because this time it wasn't happening overseas. It was happening at his doorstep, and he knew it was only a matter of time before Trevor turned his sights fully on him. Jack Donnelly had lived through ambushes in deserts, storms at sea, and firefights in villages halfway across the world. But nothing prepared him for the quiet erosion of freedom he was now witnessing on the streets of Round Rock. Each day, Trevor's imposters grew bolder, feeding on the silence of a frightened community. What unsettled Jack most wasn't the men themselves, but the effect they had on the neighbors. He saw fathers who once laughed confidently now glance nervously over their shoulders. Mothers rushed their children indoors at the sound of a knock. The very spirit of Round Rock was crumbling, not because Trevor's group was strong, but because fear had made everyone weak. Hannah saw it too. At first, she tried to shield Jack from her worries. But one evening, as they prepared dinner, she could no longer contain it. "Jack," she said quietly, placing plates on the table, "how long do we just sit here and watch?" His eyes flicked to hers. "Until we know what we're up against. And what if waiting means they take more from us?" From Melissa? From Daniel? How many people have to suffer before we say something? Jack didn't answer right away. His silence wasn't avoidance, it was calculation. He understood her frustration, but he also knew that fighting shadows without evidence would only make them both targets. Yet Hannah's words planted a seed. He realized that observation alone would never be enough. Action, at some point, had to follow. The turning point came on a chilly afternoon when Hannah walked to collect mail. At the end of the street, two imposters stopped her. Their tone was mocking, their questions intrusive. Why was she outside? Why hadn't the Donnellys paid for a compliance review? One reached for her wrist as if to force her to sign a form. She pulled back, her voice steady but sharp. "My husband will want to see this," she said. The man's smirk vanished when Jack appeared. His stride was calm but purposeful, every step radiating authority. Without raising his voice, Jack simply said, "Step away." For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a forced chuckle, the imposter released Hannah and muttered something about routine procedure. They retreated, but the exchange left its mark. Trevor's men had tested their ground and found resistance. That night, Jack sat at the kitchen table with Hannah, his notebook open. He showed her the sketches he'd drawn, faces, cars, license plates, and times. Every detail was recorded with precision. "They're not random," Jack explained. "Trevor is running this like a unit. He assigns men to streets, rotates them, and keeps pressure high. He wants unpredictability. Fear thrives on it." Hannah leaned forward. "So what do we do with this?" "First we build a case. Then we rally the people. But it won't work unless the neighbors believe in themselves again." The next day, Jack quietly began reaching out. He spoke with Melissa, reassuring her that she wasn't alone. He visited Daniel, whose car still bore the scars of vandalism, and reminded him that his courage hadn't gone unnoticed. Slowly, he planted seeds of resistance. It wasn't about charging into battle. It was about reminding people that they still had a voice. Trevor, however, sensed the shift. His eyes lingered on Jack whenever their paths crossed. The imposters began passing the Donnellys' house more often, their stares lingering a little too long. One evening, a brick was thrown against their driveway, shattering the calm. Painted across the pavement in black spray was a single word: control. Hannah's hands trembled as she scrubbed at the paint the next morning, but Jack placed his hand over hers. "They're trying to scare us," he said. "That means they're worried." Still, the intimidation spread. Melissa received a false eviction notice taped to her door. An elderly couple down the street discovered their mailbox had been ripped out. Each act chipped away at the neighborhood's morale, but each also fueled Jack's determination. One night, Jack gathered a small group of neighbors in his garage. The air smelled faintly of motor oil and dust, but the atmosphere was charged with urgency. He laid his notebook on the workbench, the pages filled with evidence. "These men aren't the HOA," Jack began. "They're imposters, criminals, and they're using fear to keep us quiet. But fear only works if we let it. We can't keep waiting for someone else to step in. We are the line between them and our homes." The group exchanged nervous glances, but for the first time, someone spoke with conviction. Daniel clenched his fists. "I'm in. I'm not letting them take this place from us." Others followed, hesitant but willing. It wasn't yet an army, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt the shift. The people of Round Rock were beginning to remember their strength, and Trevor Langley, watching from the shadows, knew his control was slipping. The sun was high over Round Rock, casting sharp shadows across the neat lawns and freshly watered flower beds. It should have been an ordinary afternoon, but an uneasy tension clung to the air. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as Trevor Langley strutted down Maple Street, two of his imposters trailing him like bodyguards. His voice, loud and commanding, echoed with false authority. That day, he wasn't here to intimidate quietly. He was here to make an example. Hannah Donnelly had just stepped out onto her porch, a basket of folded laundry in her arms, when Trevor stopped at the foot of her driveway. His smirk carried the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the street. "Mrs. Donnelly," he called out, waving a slip of paper, "you've ignored repeated warnings. Your household is now in violation. Failure to pay this fine will result in removal proceedings." Hannah set the basket down, her expression calm but firm. "There's no violation here, Trevor, and we both know you don't represent the HOA." The crowd that had gathered in silence along the sidewalks stiffened. It was rare for anyone to speak to Trevor so directly. His smirk faltered, then hardened into a sneer. "You think you're brave because your husband hides behind his military record," Trevor spat. "But out here I make the rules." Hannah's voice didn't waver. "No, you're nothing but a fraud." The words hit harder than she expected. Trevor's face flushed with anger. Without warning, he stepped forward and struck her across the face. The sound of the slap cracked through the still air like a gunshot. The basket of laundry tumbled to the ground, clothes scattering across the driveway. Gasps erupted. A child cried out, but no one moved. Trevor stood over Hannah, his chest heaving, a twisted satisfaction in his eyes. "Let that be a lesson," he growled. "Obey, or suffer." But Trevor had made his mistake. Jack Donnelly had been inside, but the moment he heard Hannah's cry, instinct propelled him forward. He burst out the front door, his steps purposeful, his presence commanding. For a brief second, the street seemed to hold its breath. Jack's eyes locked onto Trevor. Gone was the calm, patient observer. In his place stood a man forged by years of discipline and battle. "Step away from my wife," Jack said, his voice low and controlled, but carrying the weight of authority Trevor could never imitate. Trevor laughed, though his bravado wavered. "Or what, soldier?" "This isn't your battlefield," Jack didn't reply. He moved. In less than a second, his hand gripped Trevor's wrist, twisting it with precision. The fake citation slipped from Trevor's hand as he staggered, pain flashing across his face. Before the imposter trailing him could react, Jack pivoted, disarming him with a swift strike that sent the man stumbling back into the grass. Neighbors gasped, not in fear this time, but in awe. Trevor swung wildly, but Jack's training took over. He dodged effortlessly, delivering a sharp blow that sent Trevor to his knees. Jack's movements were economical, deliberate, every strike a reminder that he was not a man to be threatened. The imposters hesitated, their confidence unraveling. Without Trevor's dominance, they looked less like enforcers and more like what they truly were, criminals in cheap uniforms. Jack stood tall, his arm protectively around Hannah, who was shaken but unbroken. His voice carried across the street, louder this time, commanding not just Trevor but the entire neighborhood. "These men are not the HOA. They are imposters. They've been lying to you, controlling you with fear. But fear ends today." A murmur spread among the neighbors. People who had been silent for weeks now stepped forward, their courage ignited by Jack's defiance. One by one, they emerged from porches and yards, no longer willing to hide. Trevor, humiliated and weakened, tried to rise. His glare was venomous, but his power had slipped away in plain sight. He realized, too late, that his control had never been as strong as the silence he manipulated. Hannah, her cheeks still burning from the strike, lifted her chin with quiet strength. "You'll never scare us again." The moment marked a shift in Round Rock. No longer a neighborhood of frightened whispers, it was now a community on the brink of resistance. Trevor had crossed a line, and Jack's stand had lit the spark of unity. As the imposters retreated down the street, dragging their leader with them, the residents of Maple Street felt something stir inside them that they hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Jack knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, the people of Round Rock had seen the truth with their own eyes. And once the truth is seen, it can never be unseen. For hours after the confrontation, the neighborhood buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in weeks. The sound of Trevor's slap still lingered in people's minds. But stronger than that was the memory of Jack standing tall, defending Hannah, and exposing Trevor for what he was, a fraud. That night, front porch lights flicked on up and down Maple Street. Curtains that had been shut tight for days were drawn open. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now exchanged nervous but hopeful nods. Something had changed, something powerful. Inside the Donnelly home, Hannah sat with a cool cloth pressed to her cheek. Though the sting of Trevor's hand still burned, her eyes carried no fear, only determination. Jack watched her quietly, his own jaw tight. "You shouldn't have had to face that," he said. Hannah reached for his hand. "And you shouldn't have had to fight him alone. This isn't just our battle, Jack, it's everyone's." Her words were true. For too long, the residents of Round Rock had been isolated, each believing they were powerless. But Jack's confrontation had revealed the truth, that unity was stronger than intimidation. The following morning, something remarkable happened. Melissa, the neighbor who had hidden indoors for weeks, appeared at the Donnellys' doorstep with a tray of muffins. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "I saw what you did yesterday," she said softly. I don't want to be afraid anymore." Behind her, Daniel approached, his young son clutching his hand. The graffiti on his garage was still fresh, but his expression carried a spark of defiance. "They can't silence all of us," Daniel said. "If you're willing to fight back, so am I." Jack invited them inside, and soon more neighbors followed. One by one, they shared stories of intimidation, late-night knocks, demands for money, threats of property seizure. Each testimony added fuel to the growing fire of resistance. Jack opened his notebook, spreading pages filled with dates, times, and details. He pointed to patterns, showing how Trevor's group rotated streets, targeted outspoken residents, and used fear to maintain control. The neighbors listened intently, realizing for the first time that what they had endured was not random. It was organized manipulation. "We have two choices," Jack said firmly. "We keep hiding or we stand together. They're fewer than we are, and their power only comes from fear. If we face them as one, they can't win." The room fell silent. But then Melissa spoke. "If you lead, Jack, we'll follow." It was the first time anyone had openly voiced trust in him. Jack didn't take it lightly. He had led men in combat before, but this was different. These weren't soldiers. They were families, children, ordinary people who wanted nothing more than peace. His responsibility wasn't just to protect them, but to remind them of their own strength. Over the next few days, the neighborhood began to change. People stepped out of their homes more often, talking across fences, sharing food, and checking in on one another. Children cautiously returned to their bikes, laughter slowly weaving its way back into the air. The imposters still patrolled, but now they were met with watchful eyes instead of lowered gazes. Trevor noticed. From a distance, he watched as neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering and planning. His smirk faded, replaced by unease. He realized the crack Jack had made in his control was spreading faster than he could repair. In response, Trevor grew more aggressive. One evening, his men stormed down Elm Street, handing out bogus eviction notices. But this time, instead of quietly accepting them, residents tore the papers in half and threw them back. A chorus of voices rose up. "We're done with you!" The imposters retreated, rattled. For the first time, their intimidation had failed. That night, Jack stood on his porch with Hannah by his side. From house to house, porch lights blinked on, one after another, until the entire street glowed with a united message. "We are not afraid." Hannah leaned against him, her voice steady. "Do you see it, Jack?" "They're waking up," Jack nodded. "Yes, but Trevor won't walk away quietly. He'll push back harder, and when he does, we'll need to be ready." The neighborhood had found its courage, but courage alone wouldn't be enough. Trevor had tasted power, and men like him never surrendered without a fight. For the first time in weeks, the people of Round Rock believed they had a chance. But Jack knew the storm was far from over, and when it came, it would test everything they had built together. The awakening of Round Rock didn't go unnoticed. What began as whispers of defiance soon turned into visible acts of unity. Lights burning late into the night, neighbors patrolling their own streets, and families gathering openly without fear. For the first time in weeks, laughter returned to backyards and sidewalks, fragile but real, but Jack knew better than to mistake hope for victory. Trevor Langley was cornered now, and men like him didn't fade away. They fought harder, nastier, and dirtier when they felt their grip slipping. It began with small provocations. Tires slashed, cameras smashed, shattered glass bottles left on doorsteps as warnings. Jack documented it all, carefully logging each act of retaliation in his notebook. He knew the time had come to take the fight beyond the streets. One morning, Jack drove to the local sheriff's office, a thick file in hand. Inside were weeks of observations, license plates, photographs, timestamps, and testimonies from brave neighbors who had stepped forward. Sheriff Marlowe, a steady man with a reputation for fairness, listened intently as Jack laid out the evidence. "These men aren't HOA officers," Jack said firmly. "They're imposters running an intimidation scheme. And now that they're being resisted, they're escalating." Marlowe flipped through the documents, his brow furrowed. "You've done your homework, Donnelly. This is good, solid. But we'll need witnesses willing to testify if we're going to make this stick." Jack hesitated. He knew asking frightened families to stand in a courtroom was no small thing. But Hannah placed a hand on his arm and spoke up. "Sheriff, we'll testify, and I know others who will too. People are ready. They just need to know they'll be protected." Marlowe nodded. "Then let's build this case. But be careful. If Trevor senses law enforcement closing in, he'll lash out. And I don't want civilians caught in the crossfire." Back on Maple Street, Jack gathered his neighbors once more. In the glow of his garage light, he laid out the plan. "We're not vigilantes," he told them. "The law is on our side now, but we have to be strong until this ends. That means cameras on, lights on, and eyes open. If Trevor makes his move, we'll be ready. And we'll have proof." The neighbors agreed, their fear slowly transforming into resolve. For the first time, they felt like more than victims. They felt like a community standing on the right side of justice. But Trevor wasn't going quietly. Late one night, a black SUV rolled slowly down Maple Street, its headlights off. Inside, Trevor sat in the passenger seat, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on Jack's house. His men muttered nervously, unsettled by the sight of porch lights glowing defiantly from every home. "They're not scared anymore," one of them said, Trevor's lip curled into a snarl. "Then we remind them why they should be." The next evening, a coordinated act of intimidation unfolded. 3 imposters stormed Daniel's front yard, pounding on his door and shouting false eviction orders. Another group circled Melissa's home, shining flashlights through her windows. Across the street, someone tried to pry open an elderly couple's garage, but this time, the neighborhood was ready. Porch lights blazed. Cameras clicked. Phones dialed 911. From every direction, residents shouted, their voices carrying in unison, "We're watching you!" Startled, Trevor's men faltered. Their bravado crumbled under the weight of dozens of eyes staring back at them. Within minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Patrol cars pulled into the cul-de-sac, their red and blue lights flooding the street. Trevor's men scattered, but several were caught before they could flee. Officers pulled them out of vehicles, uncovering stacks of fake citations, forged documents, and even lock-picking tools. The evidence was damning. From his porch, Jack watched as handcuffs clicked into place. But he knew the fight wasn't over, not until Trevor himself was in custody, and Trevor was nowhere to be found. The next day, Sheriff Marlowe met with Jack. "We got 3 of his men," he said. "They're talking. Enough to confirm everything you've been saying. But Langley's slippery. He won't go down easy," Jack nodded grimly. "Then we'll be ready. He's not just after money anymore. This is about power. He wants to prove he still controls us." That evening, as the sun set over Round Rock, Jack and Hannah stood side by side watching neighbors gather in the street. Children played under the glow of porch lights. Adults shared food and laughter. Fear was still present, but it no longer ruled them. Yet Jack's instincts remained sharp. He knew Trevor was still out there, watching, waiting. The final move hadn't been played, and when it came, it would decide whether Round Rock reclaimed its peace or fell back into chaos. The quiet hum of Round Rock was deceptive. The streets looked calm, families resumed small gatherings, and porch lights still glowed defiantly each night. Yet beneath that calm, an unease lingered. Trevor Langley had vanished after his men were arrested, but everyone knew he wasn't gone. He was out there waiting, watching, and planning his return. Jack Donnelly felt it in his bones. Years of Navy SEAL service had taught him to read the silence before a storm, and this silence was thick with danger. He spent evenings pacing his home, checking locks twice, and making sure Hannah never walked outside alone. He didn't voice his fears, but Hannah saw it in the way his jaw clenched every time a car slowed near their street. The neighbors were holding strong, but doubt crept into their whispers. What if he comes back? What if this time it's worse? The arrests had weakened Trevor's operation, yet his absence made him more dangerous, like a predator biding its time. One Friday night, that time came. It was near midnight when the first disturbance erupted. A loud bang echoed down Maple Street, followed by a chorus of barking dogs. Jack bolted upright from bed, his instincts kicking in. He grabbed a flashlight and slipped a small pistol from his nightstand, his last resort. From the window, he saw movement, 3 masked men running through yards, smashing car windows and hurling bricks at doors. Spray-painted words appeared on fences. "You don't own this street." "We do." Jack's phone buzzed with frantic messages from neighbors. Hannah, her face pale, whispered, "It's him." "Trevor's back," Jack nodded grimly. "Not just back. He's making a statement." He stormed outside, and within moments, so did others. Daniel, Melissa, the elderly couple, even parents clutching their kids, all poured onto their porches, cameras rolling, voices raised. The imposters darted about, but their chaos wasn't landing like before. Instead of frightened silence, they were met with shouts of defiance. "We're not afraid of you anymore! Get out of our neighborhood!" The imposters faltered, unsettled by the wall of unity confronting them. And then, from the shadows, Trevor himself appeared. He wasn't masked. He strode into the middle of the street, his face twisted with rage, but his eyes burning with cold calculation. The man who had once thrived on fear now looked desperate, cornered by the very people he sought to control. "You think this is over?" Trevor sneered, his voice carrying through the night. "I built this. Every one of you owes me for the safety I gave you. Without me, you're nothing but sheep waiting for wolves. Jack stepped forward, his flashlight beam cutting across Trevor's face. You're not a protector. You're the wolf, and this neighborhood doesn't bow to predators anymore. Trevor laughed bitterly. You think your lights and cameras scare me? You think your little meetings mean anything? Fear runs deeper than that. I'll remind you who's in charge. He signaled, and two of his men pulled out crowbars, advancing menacingly toward Daniel's porch. Daniel froze, but before panic could take hold, neighbors surged forward, not with weapons, but with presence. Flashlights, phones, shouts. The imposters hesitated, caught in the blaze of dozens of recording lenses. Every step you take, Melissa shouted, is another piece of evidence. The imposters faltered, lowering their crowbars. Trevor's snarl deepened. He turned his fury on Jack. You! Trevor barked. You did this. You poisoned them with your soldier games. You think that because you wore a uniform once, you can lead? You're just another man hiding behind a badge that's long gone. Jack's voice was steady. I don't need a uniform to stand up to men like you. All I need is the truth, and the truth is you're finished. Trevor lunged, his rage boiling over. The sudden movement sent a ripple of gasps through the crowd. Jack braced, ready for a fight, but before Trevor could reach him, headlights flooded the street. Sirens screamed, tires screeched, and sheriff's deputies poured in from both ends of Maple Street. Hands where we can see them. The imposters scattered in panic, but this time there was no escape. Officers pinned them to the ground, weapons dropped, masks ripped away. The unity of the community had bought time, and the law had arrived to deliver justice. Trevor tried to flee, sprinting toward the cul-de-sac. Jack moved without hesitation. His years of training carried him forward in a flash. He tackled Trevor to the pavement, holding him down with unyielding strength. This ends tonight, Jack growled, his voice low and firm. Trevor struggled, but the fight was gone from him. Deputies rushed forward, slapping handcuffs on his wrists. The man who had once terrorized an entire neighborhood now sat on the curb, defeated and powerless, surrounded by flashing lights and recording cameras. The residents of Round Rock erupted in relief. Cheers broke out, hugs were shared, and tears streamed down faces that had lived too long under the shadows of fear. For the first time, they saw Trevor not as a monster in control, but as a criminal exposed. Sheriff Marlowe approached Jack, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You did well, Donnelly. You gave these people more than safety. You gave them courage. And now, with Trevor behind bars, we can finish cleaning this mess for good. Jack exhaled, the tension of weeks finally easing. He glanced at Hannah, who rushed into his arms, her tears warm against his chest. Around them, neighbors celebrated not just the arrest, but their victory over fear itself. As dawn broke, the street looked transformed. Children played freely, chalk drawings brightened sidewalks, and families shared breakfast outdoors. The spray-painted threats had been scrubbed away, replaced by laughter and hope. That evening, the community held a gathering in the park. Neighbors brought food, music filled the air, and candles were lit in a circle to symbolize their unity. Jack stood quietly at the edge, watching the life return to Round Rock. When Sheriff Marlowe gave a short speech, he turned to Jack. This man reminded us all that courage isn't about fighting battles alone. It's about standing together even when fear tries to divide us. The crowd applauded, but Jack raised his hands modestly. I didn't do this alone, you did. Each one of you who said no to fear, who stood on your porch, who turned on your lights, you reclaimed this neighborhood. This victory belongs to all of you. Hannah slipped her hand into his, her smile soft and proud. You gave them the strength to believe they could fight back, she whispered. Jack looked around, his heart full. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt peace, not just the quiet absence of danger, but the deeper peace that came from unity, courage, and justice. The imposter's reign of intimidation was over. Trevor Langley would face trial, his crimes laid bare for all to see. But the true legacy was what the neighborhood had gained. Trust, resilience, and the knowledge that together they could withstand anything. As the candles flickered under the Texas night sky, Jack knew this was more than the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a stronger, braver Round Rock, one that would never again bow to fear. And in that moment, surrounded by light, laughter, and love, Jack finally allowed himself to breathe freely. The streets of Round Rock were home again. If you enjoy these stories, make sure to subscribe to Black Battlers so you never miss the next one. Your subscription gives us the power to bring you even more emotional and inspiring stories. Join the Black Battlers family today.